welcome back to another episode of the Popcorn Square. Today we're going to be talking about Rebel Moon Part 2. I am Buttons and I'm here with
Neff and Kage.
All right, so let's just launch right into it, guys. So earlier this year, we had Rebel Moon Part 1, and this series is purely on Netflix. It is not in theaters, but we had the first Rebel Moon come out, and we talked a little bit about that one when we saw it, and of course, we just recently had Part 2 come out, so we're just going to kind of go over, what we liked about this movie, compare it to the first one, and, give you just our basic information on what we liked about the movies, what we didn't like, and of course, if we're looking forward to Part 3. So I'm just going to go ahead and say I did like this Part 2 more than the original. We talked about this before, saying that Part 1 was really kind of an introduction to the universe of it. And, I know we dove a little bit into the direct comparison for this franchise compared to Star Wars, which it was originally pitched, the story was pitched to Star Wars, and they passed on it. Mm-hmm. So, take that for what you want to say as far as the characters go, as far as, the type of universe that they're in. You can definitely see that heavily, influenced universe, but they did do some things to try and make it their own, to try and make it stand apart from that Star Wars universe. But it definitely, watching these movies, you can see the influence. One thing that I will say about this second movie is I feel like if this had been made into a TV series, they could have focused a little bit more on character development, which I feel like, you get invested in characters in these movies, and that was what was so great about Star Wars, is you had a heavy investment in the characters. You wanted to know what was going on with them. You wanted to know their backstories. You wanted to know more about what made them special. And with these ones, you have that kind of start to a lot of these characters. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, without giving too much away about the movies for those who haven't seen them, I will say they kind of fall flat with a lot of these characters that get introduced on not providing you with as much information or even uniqueness to the characters. So, I want to know that Chewbacca's got a completely different background story than Han Solo. I don't want two Han Solos. I want to know that, all these characters that involved, even if they have a common reason to come together, which is what, this movie is based on, is they're saying, hey, we have this group rising up against, the evil empire kind of democracy or whatever you want to call it. Overlords, I guess, however you want to look at that depiction of the evil, right. Or the enemy, the main oppressor. This character development to me felt like it fell short. Like they could have done more to make these characters stand out a little bit better, or make them more interesting on their own versus collectively as a group. But I'll go ahead and pass that off to Neff, and you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I have to agree with Buttons there, and I thought the movie was decent as well. I thought it was better than the first film, only because they expand upon what they did in the beginning, as Buttons said. Really, the first film, if anybody has seen it, is more like the introduction to the world itself, and then the second film really explores, and that's actually when you get into, I'd say, more character development of the core cast. But a couple people in the cast here: Sophia Botella, Jimon Honsu, Ed Skrein, Michael Huisman, Donna Bay, Ray Fisher, Stas Nair, just to name a couple, and Anthony Hopkins is on here as well. Mm-hmm. But yeah, pretty decent film, I'd say. I know it's getting panned online, but to be honest, it's not that bad of a film. We talked about this before with the first Rebel Moon film. It does look like a Netflix production. Zack Snyder is the director. I will say that as I was watching the film, in my opinion, I feel like Zack Snyder got more into his shooting style with this. If anybody's seen the Zack Snyder film, you know how he shoots films. Zack Snyder did 300, he did Justice League, he did Batman vs. Superman, he did Watchmen. So if you've seen those movies, you understand Zack Snyder's style. And I feel like in this film in particular, he really got into his bag with how he shoots films. I saw a lot of 300 influence in this. I saw some Watchmen influence. Although Watchmen is based off comic books, I still saw the influence in how he shoots films.
Like his color play and the tone.
Yeah, the
things
slowed
like that.
down dramatic shots that Zack Snyder likes to use. And so I really saw that at work more in this film than I did the first one. It did happen in the first one, but not as much. I thought the story was decent enough. Of course, there's things that could be improved on and be better, but overall, the movie was a decent film. I think Netflix is actually a great platform for this film to come out on. I do not think story-wise or character-base-wise that it is strong enough to be on the big screen, but I think for Netflix, it makes sense. And I've also said to Buttons offline that I believe that I can understand why Disney may have shot this down as a movie to put out in theater, but with the trajectory of Disney and Lucasfilm, not that it's going in a good direction, and I'm not knocking Rebel Moon as I say this, but I feel like Rebel Moon would really work as a series, kind of like how they do Obi-Wan, Ahsoka, stuff like that, rather than a theatrical 2-hour film. I just don't feel like it has enough meat and potatoes to cut through to an audience like that. But I thought the acting was decent enough. Like I said, the writing, it's okay. It's an okay film. Not strong enough to be on the big screen, but I think it's strong enough to be on a Netflix like platform. And with Netflix's distribution, I think it actually reaches a lot of eyeballs. And Zack Snyder was on Joe Rogan actually speaking about the distribution model that Netflix has. So I think it works for them in that aspect. We know that this budget was $88 million because they shared a budget with the first film. So together, two films, $166 million. So it is an expensive film, but they have found a way to make a sci-fi action film for a decent amount of money. $88 million, I think it looks decent. To me, I feel like if Zack Snyder had more money to work with, of course he could make things look a little different, maybe even a little better. But I didn't feel overall that the visuals were bad. I thought they were decent enough, and they played the part that they needed to play. And like I said, with this film, I'm sure Buttons will agree, I'm seeing a lot more of Zack Snyder's style come out, especially with the explosions, the the spaceships, the color, all of that type of stuff.
His normal things
Even
that
down
make
to
him
wardrobe,
stand out.
right?
Yeah.
Even down to wardrobe choices and just how you shoot a scene. I feel like this movie really expounded upon that, so that's why I kind of gave it a higher score than that first film. Got something, Buttons? What you got?
Oh no, I was just gonna say, I know when we did talk about part one, we brought up the whole suit and tie thing in space, and that I think is maybe a little bit more direct influence from Zack Snyder. But as far as the wardrobe goes, and you make some good points, Neff, about this being a movie or a trilogy or however many movies they're planning on doing with this, that really is, I believe, made for streaming. It's like you said, the budget, it's a good budget. I'm not going to say that it's under, funded, but it definitely, the cast that they got is, I haven't had any issues with them as far as acting wise. Like I feel like all the characters that they play, they bring their own thing to the table, and they make individual characters. The actors are, believable as those characters. It's not like, oh, we can't imagine, I can't remember the actor's name that plays the general.
Let me see that.
But I've seen him in.
He's definitely the main antagonist of the film, guys. If you're familiar with the movie,
Yeah,
so
he's
the main antagonist. there.
he's got enough of what is believable as him, and you want to root for the good guys as they're doing their whole fight scenes and everything like that, because he's got that kind of, it's almost like an insanity to him, or
Yeah.
just kind of just twisted mind, maybe, because it's not like he's truly insane or anything.
True.
But
He's there, but he's
there, but
definitely unhinged at certain points in time.
exactly. And so as you're watching his character and the acting that goes behind it, you're kind of like, oh yeah, he's a twisted individual. And one of the things for me when it comes to villains especially is, if I end up hating the character, then the actor did a good job.
Right.
Because, because you can give them and say, oh yeah, you're supposed to play a bad guy. Be a bad guy. Okay, well, is that really enough to drive the story? But his acting and the way he took on the role and the writing, the way it was written for him, you sit there and you're like, yeah, I don't like that guy either. Like, I'm ready. He needs to die.
Right,
Like,
and his name in the movie's Atticus Noble, and
Atticus.
that's played by Ed Skrein. That's Ed Skrein there. So yeah,
Okay.
he's the main antagonist, like Button said, and yeah, he does a good job of depicting his role, how it was written on the paper. So
Right.
you know, you feel a certain way about it when he comes on screen. You're like,
Yeah.
okay, I know this guy is the bad guy. I know what he's up to, and so that's a way to look at the film.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I said, just to continue kind of what me and Buttons were saying about this. To me, in direct comparison, I like this film more because, and not to give away too much, they actually bring the fight to the home front.
Right.
And so it reminded me
It's
kind of
kinda-
like
it's-
Dune, where it's like you
guerrilla,
see that
guerrilla warfare. you
guerrilla
know?
warfare tactics.
Yeah.
You see that they actually have the advantage, although overpowered technologically
Correct.
by the antagonists. You know what I mean?
They
But
made it a
since they're
very
at
much
home, it's
farmers
very
versus
even balanced, and
soldiers,
it kind of
yeah.
reminded me of like the Battle of Arrakis type deal, where it's like
So-
they go there. The Harkonnen got a lot of tech and they got a lot of firepower, but they
the
don't know where
Fremen
they're.
have sand
Yeah, they
power.
don't know who they're.
Desert.
Desert
they're,
power,
they're in a
yeah.
foreign land, right?
Yeah.
And so they go there thinking just because we're technologically advanced and we're brutes that we can win, but they don't know the landscape. And so I saw a lot of that in this film. Now, obviously, this film was probably shot, you know, maybe even in cohesion with Dune.
Possibly,
so
yeah.
it's not like Zack Snyder said, "Oh, I'm going to do that." But it
Well,
reminded
they're
me
two
of
different-
watching
They're two very different
way
movies.
different.
Yeah.
But to me, that aspect, it reminded me of that.
Right. Yeah.
Having the advantage, even though this group over here may be more advanced than
Yeah.
you and even stronger in certain aspects.
Yeah, good point. Kage, did you have
Yeah,
some
what'd you
thoughts?
get?
So I want to say something. So just given my schedule, unfortunately I haven't had the chance to see Rebel Moon, either 1 and 2. Came back from vacation recently, so definitely couldn't see the second one. But me representing the people that haven't seen it, can you guys kind of speak on, just kind of give me a synopsis? I mean, without giving too much away, like what is Rebel Moon about? What is part 1 about, and how does it lead into
Part 2.
part 2? Can you give me like a synopsis, if you will?
So basically, you're set up to a planet, right? They're a bunch of farmers, basically, the village that they live in. Now, the main character,
Cora.
yes, she was an off-worlder or outsider, however you want to call it, that crash landed on this planet, and the village took her in, accepted her as one of their own, and she had been living there for, maybe a couple years or so.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how it starts out, is you're like, okay, here they are, they're kind of salt of the earth people, villagers, and then you have the general come in and they're demanding. So normally they would pay like any other, planet within this, they pay like a tithe. They're like, hey, you need to provide for the
service
empire.
or-
Yeah.
yeah.
So they're like, yeah, we need wheat. Like, you guys grow wheat, we
Okay.
need the wheat, the flour,
In this
whatever.
amount of time.
Yeah, and basically what it is you have this huge starship, with, I don't know, thousands of people, right? And this is a village of maybe like 100, like,
So this would
You
be
know.
like the Empire.
yeah, so
I'm
this is.
starting to get the vibes. I'm starting to understand the
So-
Dune reference. You're going to
and-
give
and
us
Star
spice,
Wars.
or we're going to come down and kill you.
Yeah, or Star Wars, right?
Yeah.
So like you have like the big bad empire, right? And they're like, oh, you peasants, you must provide for us. We provide you protection from all the other whatever, right? Out there that could do you harm. So you need to pay your dues to us. And here they come, basically land on the planet and demand, like, we demand you to give us everything. Now, Cora's character basically fights back against that because, they kind of allude to, oh, she has a past, but we're not going to tell you too much about what it actually is. But again, she's like one of those people where it's all like, oh yeah, she probably was at some point a soldier, and
So
you know,
she's
we
trying to
don't-
lie low.
she's trying to lie low, right? But
Okay.
and like I said, the villagers and the other people, they kind of know a little bit, but it's not like she went out and was all like, oh yeah, I used to be in the army, and this is
Right.
you know,
And
this
I
is what
used to
happened.
be
And
with these people.
yeah, exactly. So they kind of, in that sense, they're like, you came here, you made yourself part of our society as far as being helpful and you know, wanting to participate for the good of the community.
Right.
So we're gonna accept you, even though we know that you have a past, kind of thing. Like that
Okay.
was basically how it was set up. Now, that being said, she's like, no, these are bad people. Things are not gonna go how you think they're gonna go. Like, we have to fight back. And when that happens, basically, people die, as they do when you try to
Fight back.
stand up for yourself, and they kill like the town elder leader guy or whatever, the head honcho, and that's basically what escalates the story forward in part one. Now, part two is basically after that escalation happened, and she's like, oh man, we got to pull together to help defend our colony because they're going to come for us. Like, that's what it is. They're like, oh crap, we pissed them off. Now they're going to come in full force.
And her in particular, because she was part of this group.
Right, they recognized her, basically. They were like, oh, we know who you are. And so, like I said, I don't want to give too much away for people who haven't seen it, but they're like,
Okay.
oh, we know who you are.
All right.
You're a deserter, you know, and basically we're gonna come for you. We're gonna destroy this whole village.
That's the catalyst for the story.
That's the catalyst for
Okay.
the story. We're gonna
right.
scorch the earth and make an example and all this stuff, right?
All right.
So she's like, oh man, I need to go out because I did this. She has so much guilt over, you know, she's like, what would have been, you know, an unfortunate thing turned into a disaster. You know, basically, like I said, they're like, oh yeah, we're coming, we're gonna kill everybody. So she goes off and she finds other warriors. And that's kind of like the end of part one, is like, I went out and I found
She
my.
assembles the Avengers.
Yeah,
basically.
the
Different people with
Scargiver
certain
Avengers.
skills, correct? To
Particular
fight
set of
against-
skills.
Who
Right,
have,
okay.
who have beef with the
Right.
Empire as well,
To fight
right?
against them.
You know, so, all of these.
Hence the name Rebel.
Right, Rebel
okay,
Moon,
all
yeah.
right.
Because I can't remember the name of the planet, but you know, the whole rebel, like you said, is a bunch of rebels, right?
All right.
So they gather in, and then the second one comes in. The second movie is basically what we talked about. She has her group that she's assembled that are going to help the villagers on the planet defend against the invasion. Now, again, as Neff mentioned, way overpowered technologically. Anthony Hopkins' character is actually interesting because he's kind of plays, like, they go into the lore of like the main story that drove everything in terms of like why Core is there on the planet, and you know, the empires, because they call themselves Warriors of the Fallen King or something like that. So soldiers of the Fallen King, something. But basically, they took a political thing, because there is obviously always going to be a political background, even
Yes,
with
definitely that undertone.
yeah, definitely that thing, and they bring to light some different things. There's and that's where you kind of get into, you know, things that are related to Star Wars, but things that are also kind of similar to Witcher lore, in my
Really?
opinion. So yeah,
Okay.
you got kind of like this. Here's where I was talking to my boyfriend, and I said, you know, I was like, oh, here's Mandalorian. Here's like, you know,
You're seeing
here's
the
where-
influences.
Here's where they could have
Yeah.
tied things together in a Star Wars universe, and you know, made things a little bit different or connect differently because of that Star Wars
And
influence.
this goes back to what you guys said earlier about it was originally pitched as a Star Wars. It could be
Right.
something
It
pitched as
could
a
have
Star
been
Wars story set in that universe, right?
And so you kind of see a little bits of those influences and
Right.
things that could have tied to the Force,
Right,
or
and-
could have tied to, you know,
The Empire.
So
the
without
Empire,
see-
right.
without
Different
seeing
spin
this,
on what they're doing in a different area.
Exactly.
so without seeing this, based on what you've told me, I can see the resonances. I feel like I think that's something worth applauding. That hey, we want to set a story in the Star Wars universe. Lucas, Disney, who owns that, is going to say, nah, okay, fine, we're going to make our own thing. And it may not have hit it out of the park review-wise, but you got to respect that they took something that was meant for something else and repurposed it and made it their own.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's a
it
good
sounds
point.
like a good watch in its own right.
It's decent. Like, it's not the best. To me,
Yeah.
it's a decent movie.
I
It's
think
not
I
the
think
best, but it's
because
cool. Like,
I think
Yeah.
to your point, Neff, I think you're right. There are definitely some gaps in the story, and I think perhaps that could just be a scramble of them trying to rewrite it. What would have been directly tied to certain things. I mean, you look at the movie. That was the standalone for Star Wars, the
Han Solo.
Rogue One?
Rogue One.
Oh, yeah,
So you
yeah,
get
yeah.
Rogue One, and you can kind of see how they could have inserted this story as its own standalone thing, somewhere in between, episode 3 and 4 maybe. Like they could
Yeah.
have inserted this in there without any issues.
Okay.
Or even if they wanted to go all the way back to, like I said, maybe around the Mandalorian time
Era,
frame
yeah.
and thrown it in there. They could have done that too.
I
but
think, and that's a good point you brought up, Button, because like I said, when I said earlier, I think it works better as like a TV show series instead of just like a movie. I think like what Buttons is saying, based off the skeleton of it, this could be something that you could have seen in the same vein as a Rogue One type film.
Right.
Like I said, these characters, it would have to be different. It'd have to be a lot different. Of course, there'd be more money behind it. There'd be bigger
Because-
actors behind it. But the skeleton is something that could be utilized for sure.
Because let me pitch something to you as if this was Star Wars. The people that they avenge it, or that they bring in, like you described them, they're Avengers, right?
Yeah.
So imagine these are either the few remaining
Jedi?
or like few remaining Jedi who are still out there on the fringe, or something to that effect.
The Empire is hunting them down. Order 66.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, or even just a matter of, these are a few
Or like-
rebels that still resisted and, during that
Jedi
time.
being aided and abetted by a planet,
Right.
that the Empire doesn't know about, and then
Right.
gains knowledge of, and says, these people are aiding and abetting Jedi. We're going to go there. We're going to search this thing out.
Right.
We'll cover what we're really trying to look for, but we're looking for Jedi. And we're going
Right.
to just scare them, and hopefully they give up the goods.
Right,
So,
exactly.
that makes
And
sense.
because, I
Okay.
mean, when you get.
I can see that.
When you get into like the original trilogy, here's Ben, right? Living, Ben Kenobi living on this thing, and they're all like, oh yeah, stay away from him, he's weird. But there he is hiding out as a Jedi, unbeknownst to the people on the planet, right? So I mean, that's kind of the gist of it. And again, for me, I feel like the story could use a little bit more development on the characters. Like you said, part one, you're introducing the universe. You're not going to spend that much time on the individual characters. Second one, like you said, they do go more in depth on
And
these
each of those main
characters.
characters we talked about.
Right. They try and bring more to them, and even some of the the villagers, they kind of give them a little bit of stories too.
Okay.
There's a little love interest story between like the converted soldier and one of the villager girls, kind of thing, and that was the kid soldier,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So so you see, and then you get like Anthony Hopkins' character, who's kind of like this. He's a robot, all right. So, and I'm not saying he's
And
like
there was-
C-3PO
and there was
or
some, like,
anything.
some
He's like
creator-
a soldier.
There was some creator and like
Yeah.
stuff that kind of stuck out. It's like a melting pot of these ideas.
So-
Right.
But like you said,
And
Buttons,
that's why,
that,
and that's
I
why,
remember, yeah.
that's why I say I could have used a little bit more development on that, because it does kind of feel like a little bit of a melting pot where you're like, I want to know more about this particular character, but you just don't have the time. And if it was a
So-
series, they could have focused a little bit more
Yep, you
on
can
those
really
individual.
expound upon
Yeah.
that.
Well, yeah, we talked about this like with video game adaptations where video games are 20, 30-hour experiences. And when you try to make a movie, you have to, for the sake of budget, you have to cherry pick things that you have.
Time and budget,
right,
yeah.
Right, and it always boils down to that. Let's just call it what it is. But when you have a show, you can now get more time, get more budget to really break it out. The Avatar, the Avatar Airbender, got great reviews, got approved for multiple seasons, despite the budget squishing things together and everything. But even still, shows are better than movies. When you want to tell a great big story like
Right.
any space opera, I think you'd want to see that. But based on what I'm hearing you guys say, do you feel like the story was, I don't know if spread too thin is the right words, like you keep introducing characters, stories within stories. You want to tell a little bit more about this person. You want to tell more about this person, and it gives you so many, but you don't get to really deep
So
dive.
funny
Like,
point.
Do you
It's
think
not
it overall?
spread thin.
Okay.
I
It's
think
actually
there's too
condensed.
much information, and it's condensed, and the time that you'd have for a film is not enough to really open up.
Well, going
all
back to
those
my point that
facets.
it would be better as a show based
Right.
on what you guys.
That's
are
what I
saying.
saw. I
So-
said as a show, I don't think it'd be getting panned as bad.
Yeah, let me
Like-
give you a direct comparison. Okay, so in the first movie, you're introduced to this other group of rebels, right? Like they've got a whole fighting army force that are constantly working to fight against the empire, right? So in them going to look for support, to look for help from them, they introduce some characters. Now, these characters are kind of like the rebellion, you know, they're the rebel alliance, union force, whatever you want to call it, right? So in Star Wars, that's who they would have been. They would have been, you know, the rebels. And in this world or this universe or whatever, you know, you're introduced to these characters, and there's two main standout, I guess you could call them generals. And they're brother and sister, okay? So they kind of have their whole backstory, and you want to know more about this. You would like to know more about like how they got started, what their backstory is, what makes them unique as individual characters.
Okay.
And because me personally, I really liked the character, one of the characters in particular, and you know, you get him to join their group. Like he's like, yep, I will, you know, I believe what you're doing is good, and you know that's what we're here for, and I'm going to join you. And you know, so with that introduction of that character, if this was a series, you could have found out more about their backgrounds and more about what's going on. But then you have a main story that they're driving because it's a movie. They have to have a beginning, a middle, what do they call it? Like not the arc, but the main catalyst or the main final battle or whatever you want to call it.
The
you know,
third
like,
act.
Yeah, the third act, you know, and then
climax
of- Yeah,
the
okay,
climax,
that's very good.
exactly. So you got to have your climax, and then of course it's like wrapping up rapidly at the end to be like, oh, here's all your resolution, right? And in this one, because they already knew that it was going to be multiple series, it's like you get to that climax, and then instead of having a resolution, it basically climax, okay, go to the next movie. Like the
Okay.
resolution is very minimal, because they're like, yeah, you're going to be launched right into another
Oh
movie.
yeah, and that was my next point.
Like
Was
look at Insidious as an example, right? Like all these things happen, and then you're like, oh, you know, right at the very end, they're like, oh shit, what does everybody know? They just cut to black.
Right.
That's not how Rebel Moon was done, but it has definitely a sharp, dramatic, you know, fall off, because you're like, okay, now I gotta wait till part 2 to find out what's going on with everybody.
I would say from a sci-fi action standpoint, that Rebel Moon, from a writing aspect, it's not really that depthy with the writing. It's
No.
very surface level sci-fi action, right? And then you see all the influences that are being pulled in by Zack Snyder just to
Right.
get the point across. But like I said, this is not a movie where you feel like you need to listen to every word because this is tied to this and that's tied to that, and there's all this intricacies because the story is just not that depthy.
They gloss over a lot of it. It's
Right.
like, oh, this is a war torn country, or oh, hey, my childhood was rough. Like that's why I'm a rebel,
It's
because I had
very
a rough
just
childhood.
surface level stuff.
They might give some of the main characters, especially in part 2, they gave some of the main characters like, hey, here's my background.
Yep, and I was
And-
gonna say that they
Yeah.
really go into in this film, like Button said, they assemble the Avengers, right? All the Avengers go back, and the moon is called Veldt, right?
Veldt,
They
okay.
go back to Veldt with Cora, who's really like the leader. She's kind of brought all these guys together, and then her love interest as well, who is played by I believe Michael Huisman. And his name in the movie is Gunnar, right?
Yeah, Gunnar.
So they assemble, right? And he's really like the homeworld guy of Veldt. Like he's
Yeah,
kind of like
yeah,
the
he
young
was-
leader now, and he's
Yeah, because
he-
after
right,
in the first movie,
right,
when
he
the
kind of
leader
takes
was-
over, right,
yeah.
and so that ends up being Cora's love interest as this story plays out. But they end up coming back to Veldt, like we just said, and then you actually go into with part 2 of Rebel Moon. They go into their reasoning for really teaming up against
okay.
basically
They
the
had like a little
Empire, Imperium, whatever you
They
want to
had
call
like
them.
a fun little like slumber party type, thing where it's like, okay, if we're gonna trust each other, we have to know each other's stories. Like we
Yeah.
have to understand
what's your motive
why
for
you're
being
in the
here.
group, like
Right.
what's going on
Okay.
with you. And they, like I said, they try and give you more of the background information.
That's their development there.
Right, the character development. They try and give you, but like I said, for this particular thing, I feel like, them going in and giving them backgrounds and everything, it's important, but at the same time, don't get me invested in a character and then not give me that character's development, because it's a very two-dimensional character at that point. It's like if they were to like sit there and, I don't know, let me say like Darth Maul, right? So Darth Maul, like you introduce, he's a bounty hunter. You're like, okay, he's a bounty hunter. And then he dies. And you're like, well, but everybody wants to know where he came from, what his motivation was, why did he do the things
Okay.
he did? Like, like all you did was introduce this super badass character and then you killed him.
So they should either introduce less characters.
I think that would help make the
Or-
story tighter. 'Cause you don't
Yeah,
have
like
to bounce
introduce,
around so
like
much.
just have less characters and expound. Like just pick a group.
We talked about this with Maverick. Okay, Top Gun. They have all these people, and they go into like this whole scene of, oh yeah, I joined for this reason, and I'm this and I'm that, and they introduce these young fighter pilots, and here's my life story, and da 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 da, and all this information. It had nothing to do with the story. It didn't drive anything. It didn't add anything.
So was it filler?
So why did I have
Do you
this?
think?
Did you see Maverick?
I did not.
Oh, okay.
You need to watch Top Gun, right?
First.
And then watch Maverick.
Yeah.
I've
But
watched Top Gun
I
back in the day.
preferred Top Gun from a story standpoint
Right.
over Maverick, and me and Buttons
Maverick
have talked about
visuals
this.
and-
Maverick
and-
visuals, obviously it's
Way
better than Top
better.
Gun 1,
Way
but if we're
better.
talking story and depth of story, Top Gun 1's way better than Maverick.
Exactly.
Like, in my
Okay.
opinion.
Because when they do focus on characters and actors and things like that, you see them grow.
It
you
matters.
You see what it ties into the story, like how it drives the story, having an understanding of who these characters are and how they interact with each other. And like I said, they tried to do this with part 2. They tried to say, here's my character, here's how I drive the story and our interactions with each other.
Correct.
But they have like, let's just say there's 10 of them, right? That they've between part 1 and part 2, that they introduce these characters, give them a backstory, give them a driving factor that's going to move the story forward. And really, they could have cut it down to like 5.
Yep.
Okay.
So it's not that you wouldn't want the character development for those other 5, but for the story that they're trying to tell, you really didn't need all 5 of those, the 5 extra characters. If they had focused on just the 5, find a way to tie it to the story, to move the story forward
So you
just
feel
with those
like
5.
So you
This-
can
It
balance it out well, and she makes a good point. You can balance it out well because you're actually on Veldt, so you have the army of people to fight against the antagonist group, correct? So you don't need the 5 characters as much if you think about it. And what that would do is if you take a couple characters out, it goes both ways. yes, you can then focus more of your attention on those characters and build them up better so that the audience has a connection with them without spreading it thin, correct? Because we have a 2-hour film to do this. We don't have 3 shows to talk about each character, which it would work that way. Or this is the other end. You do have a small amount of characters, but then it doesn't seem believable because they're up against this juggernaut. So it's like, how do these 3, even with these people have no tools, they have really no skills
No
when it comes
training.
to combat. How does that work? So it's like this weird balance where if you have 5, it works that way, but you got to spin it a specific way when you're talking about development. But then if you limit the amount, you have 3 that you can really focus on, but is it believable through the viewer's eyes? Things you can get around in a sci-fi action film, but it has to make sense.
Yeah.
In Dune, everybody in Arrakis knew how to fight.
So
Completely different ball game. They're not villagers. Like
And-
this,
Yeah.
they're villagers. So these 5 people, like Buttons is saying, these people are trained to fight.
and a good
different, like,
and a
you
good
know.
and a good comparison, if you want to again do something directly compared to Star Wars, is you could sit there and you say, okay, you had your group, you had Luke, Leia, Han Solo, and Chewie, and let's just say there was those 4, right? Like now you're going to be introduced to other characters. You're going to see Yoda. You're going to see Obi-Wan. You're going to see these other characters pop up, and they play their roles, and they have Count Dooku and all these other people, and then when you start talking about like your generals, your rebel generals, and things like that, who are important characters, and you get a little bit of information about who they are and
Correct.
what their importance is, but there's no huge long focus on the lore of Yoda in the stories. Sure, later on they expound on tons of things about that. They're like, oh, he was a da 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 da, and he lived from this time to that time, and fan fiction kind
Yeah.
of basically.
Right.
Like where did George Lucas come up with Yoda? Like how does he see his character? But it's not explained in the movies in depth.
Yeah.
They give
Yeah.
in depth, here's Luke, here's Leia, here's their backstory. And then guess what? This group of people that you've invested in, they go from place to place. They're on a destroyer, they're on Endor, they're on, you know what I mean? Like they go, and of course you've got the different interactions with these different characters, but you have your core group of people and they travel around. And they
Okay.
tried to set this up with Rebel Moon, but I think they just had too many. I feel like, if they had cut it down to like just 5 and just been like, these are the 5 people, but they have like this other person, and you're just like, wait, I don't, like, was that guy or that guy? Because the stories are very similar. We were like, me and my boyfriend, we were sitting there watching, you're like, who was that one again? Was he the one that was the prince? Or was that guy the one that was, their family was killed on the planet? Or, who are,
Yeah.
because it's too many characters to focus your attention on when things are happening. And again, you go into that believability factor, like Neff was saying, and it's like, yeah, you can't just be like, oh, this small little village is gonna defeat an entire thing of, with untrained soldiers against a huge onslaught of higher technology and trained soldiers,
And I think it's a good point, because now I just thought about it after like really thinking about it. And with the first film, Cora is like the main character, right? And she's the main character, and then she goes and assembles people, and it's like, okay, well, they're going to be this team. I feel like in part 2, Cora is the main character, but they also tried to bring everybody up to her level.
Exactly, and it's too
Even
many.
though the battle is
The
between
first-
her
Many
and
of
the
them.
main
The
antagonist.
first movie was about kind of her story
Yes.
coming
It
up,
was
and the
almost
second movie,
more of her story in the first one, and then the second one touches on it in the beginning, but then goes more into the other people
and
and,
it's
then the
the
villagers.
second movie is about giving them time to
Trying
shine,
to-
build
yeah.
them.
Right.
Okay, I
Yeah.
gotcha.
But like I said, I still feel like it was too many
The
characters.
second film was more of the war movie, where you
Yeah,
have
it was
that
definitely a lot more
home front
action.
battle,
Yeah.
way more action. That's when I
So-
said Zack Snyder really started showing his
And they did have
stylistic
some really
approach.
cool, visual effects and things like
Yeah, it was
that.
cool.
I mean, they had like trench warfare. That was very interesting. I enjoyed that. I was like, ooh, there they are in the tunnels, and the way that it was shot too was very interesting, because it was almost like first person perspective at some point.
That
Like
too,
where you
yeah.
see it, you're just
And
kinda
I like how Zack Snyder would be able to. Now, obviously, with these things we talked about, these 2 buttons, when you approach this, it has to kind of make sense, especially when it's in accordance to time. But Zack Snyder had a good he had a good approach to showing different perspectives of different characters at the same time.
Right. Within
and
the
it didn't feel
battle.
like it didn't feel like it was out of sync. So I
Okay.
thought that was pretty cool how he was able to do that, even showing a villager pulling a pin to a grenade. The guy is like pulling the pin, then he's like struggling with the pin, and there's something else, and he finally pulls it, but it goes back. Like it's not like, oh, this is chop weird. Like it went pretty
Yeah.
pretty fluid. So I thought
Cohesive,
that
yeah.
was pretty cool. Let's talk about some viewership numbers. Netflix is
Ah.
still kind of putting that out there. And I actually reported on this on the weekly. Netflix is actually going to stop reporting their subscriber numbers in 2025.
Really?
Yeah, we'll talk about that offline, but I think that's an interesting business move there. But viewership, after premiering April 19th on Netflix, the film garnered 21.4 million views in 3 days, making it the most viewed English language film on the service from April 15th to 21st. It was the third consecutive Netflix #1 for Snyder, starting with Army of the Dead and continuing with Rebel Moon Part 1. However, it would score 44.2 million viewership hours, making a significant decline from the first one. So
Okay.
this didn't perform as well.
Right.
So
and
it
it's,
really,
again, probably just because people didn't enjoy the first one. And I think, like I said, I feel like it's unfair in the sense that, I don't think that they're bad movies, like we mentioned before. I just think that most people wanted more action.
Yeah.
And this second one definitely had a good chunk of action.
Right, yeah.
So, in that sense, when you're releasing it, if they had done this as a series versus movies, I feel like it would have performed a lot better. I think people would have given it a better chance. It would have, sometimes when you break things into small chunks, and this has kind of been the meme. It's like, how dare you make me want to sit down and try and present me with a 3-hour movie, but I will binge watch like 12 seasons of a show in,
Yeah,
48 hours.
in 40 hours because, but I can't sit down and watch a 3-hour movie. So
Yeah, I get
it's
you.
Yeah.
like, dang it, I'm in,
Yeah, so making a direct reference to the first film, like we said, 44.2 million hours watched, and then part one was 54.1 million hours watched in the first 3 days. So we are seeing that decline. And two, also, it could be, we've seen this effect before, the first initial film gets the attraction from the audience and excitement, and then once people digest that, they decide, how they're going to approach it. Maybe if there's other films in the works, you could watch a film the first time and be like, okay, it got me in the theater, but I don't like what they did. I'll pass on the second one. And I think that's what you're seeing,
Right.
rather than people watching it like they watched the first one and then judging it as a complete body of work. Like I said when we talked about the first Rebel Moon, I want to see the first and second so then I can judge it. Because with the first, I only have one part. I need to see
Yeah,
the second
makes
part.
sense.
So
Right.
if you don't watch the second part, you're not doing yourself a service.
Sure.
Yeah.
If you're just not interested in it, then it's not for you. But I think that's why it leads to these numbers being lower. And it's 10 million hours less. It's significant, but it still did 44 million views.
It still means that they
or
got
44
an
million
audience, a
viewership
return.
hours, I should say.
Yeah, if you put out a new idea and you're like, this is completely different from anything else that you've ever seen before, and you get an audience, like you said, of, like, we'll just say it was 50 million, right? Like you get 50 million people come in and watch the movie to give it a fair shot. They're like, yep, I'm going to go and I'm going to watch it. And then the next sequel comes out, you're like, yeah, we had 50 million people come out and watch this movie. They must have really liked it. Well, not necessarily. 50 million are the people who gave it a shot. 50 million are the people who are like, you know what, this movie looks interesting. I'm going to see if it's something that I'd be interested in.
Yeah.
And then, these studios that bank on, oh yeah, there's going to be all these people, word of mouth. I'm going to get all my fans who saw the first movie and really liked it. They're going to come back and see the sequel, and maybe they're going to tell their friends and bring more people in, and it's going to perform as well. But no, you're going to be lucky on any sequel for anything to get 70% of your audience to come back and watch the sequel.
Okay.
Because there's always going to be that group. However, like I said, I feel like 30% is a good kind of number where they're going to be like, yeah, I'm going to pass.
Yeah.
It wasn't for me. I went and saw it, thought it was gonna be something different, or I just didn't really enjoy the style it was shot in, or
Sure.
I didn't feel like the
I
writing or
think
the
I
story
think
was there.
advertisement. We've talked about this on previous episodes. Advertisement can really play a big role in how well a movie does. If you show me one trailer 6 months ago and then all of a sudden you put it out, you know, you're lucky if I remember it.
Right.
You have to keep you. It's a kind of a balance. You have to say, oh, how much trailers do I put out? I don't want to tell the whole story, but at the same time, I want to keep it in people's minds. I want them to see the movie
So
that I
on
made.
top of what you're saying, because that's a good
Directors and
point, but
actors,
also like we
audience
talked
draw.
about before, this is why it was important to get this movie out within a good time frame of the first movie coming out.
Right.
Right, yeah,
Months.
you got to do
If
it
you
while
would
it's
have
still
waited
fresh
8
in
months for
people's
this,
minds.
it probably would have did worse.
Oh, I remember watching Rebel Moon 2 years ago. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
lucky. You got to keep it relevant. You know what I mean? If you're going to do we've talked about that with sequels. You know what I mean? A sequel
Keep
generally.
your
It's got to
audience
stay
interested.
fresh, right?
Yeah, because when you do sequels decades later,
Takes 'em out
now
of it
you're
completely.
now you're in iffy territory. Now you're specifically catering to nostalgia factor. You know what I mean? And that's a really
You're boxing yourself in.
you really are.
Unless you really knock it out the park with the first one to where it's so significant with impact that it's just like, okay, I have to go watch this. And you don't see that too much anymore.
And we talked about like with Beetlejuice. We know about that from our childhood. Ghostbusters. When they said a new Ghostbusters movie is coming out, people are like, "Ooh, I want to see that." Minus, of course, the all women's Ghostbusters. We won't talk about that, but like people, you know what I mean. You know what you're getting with
Yes,
Ghostbusters.
yes.
You know what you're getting with the, Beetlejuice, and so Rebel Moon is still really. You say
It's
even
new.
I haven't seen it, but I know
and
I
it's
know
interesting.
about it. You know what I mean?
It doesn't have the luxuries that Star Wars has.
Yeah, and
Doesn't.
Yeah.
No, I mean, like I said, you can definitely watch this and you can see the influence.
for
It's
sure.
very blatant in some particular spots,
Mm-hmm.
especially. But for all we've talked about with Rebel Moon, I will say this is when you look at the story as a whole, and I'm pretty sure they're gonna have their part 3 because
What do you think about that?
you mean about as far as like what part 3 is?
Or what you think? Are you interested personally? And then what do you think part 3 goes into?
I do want a part 3.
Interesting.
Because they leave a lot of questions open in 2, and they kind of go back to the beginning to where you're like, oh, here's a twist, like here's a different thing. Now, again, the tactics that they're using are not new or original. These are things that you've seen in other movies. So don't go in there thinking that it's like a Shyamalan twist to where you're like, oh, it's a big reveal that's truly original. No, it's not. It's not original in any way, and we predicted it. Me and my boyfriend were like, yeah, this is what's going to happen. And that's what it was. Now, not saying it wasn't still interesting, not saying that it didn't capture my attention and want more, because it did. I do want to know. I'm like, ooh, now I want to know what
invested.
they're, yeah. And so, I mean, some of these tricks and twists that they have, they do them on purpose because they want the audience to be like, ooh, now I want to know. So, I mean, they definitely had that and it wasn't like that in the first one. In the first one, you have a character and yeah, okay. And then you have the introduction of all these new characters and I want to know what's happening with them. Like that's kind of what they did. And the second one, you're kind of like, ooh, now we're all this fighting and like you're enjoying the fighting. You're like, ooh, look at how they're doing everything and it's fun and it's entertaining. And then they go back and like what Neff had said is the first one kind of focused it a lot on her background. The second one, the stuff that they brought in her background was related to like the history of their again, they're soldiers of the fallen king, order of the fallen king or something like that. But they give more information about the king, like how she's related to that story, how her name is associated. So she is called the Scargiver. And like that talks about her story, in particular, her past. And so while they went over everybody else of the new introductory characters that they brought in, their Avengers group, they didn't really touch too much on her story until towards the end of the movie, where they're like, oh, now we're tying in like her big dark secret or
Correct.
her big, whatever, more than what they covered in the first movie.
Right.
Because in the first movie, they kind of are like, yeah, this is my torrid story past and whatever. And then they just kind of like move into the rest of the story. And in this one, you kind of really see more from an emotional standpoint, like how it messed her up, like how, like, it's been her driving factor. Like, she's like, I have to sacrifice myself to save everybody because I'm a horrible person. And you're like, well, yeah, but you're not more horrible than, and they're like, no, you don't understand. I'm more horrible. And they're like, no, you're just, no, you don't understand. I am.
Let me jump off the bridge.
Jesus.
Yeah, so,
But yeah, that's a good point. For me, I'm kind of indifferent. Like, obviously, the way the second part ends, and like I said, we're not trying to give away too many spoilers, it is open-ended. So
Yes.
it
Yeah.
alludes to, okay, there's going to be
There's
another
more.
task, another
Avengers
yeah,
movie.
there's definitely going to be more to come from this storyline. But like I said, it's so funny. Like I said, it worked better as a show. Now
It
we're
would.
getting part 3. Okay, well now we're starting to get into show territory.
So
it's like, what are we doing here, Zack Snyder?
So
Is this a
that's
show?
confirmed. We are greenlit for third.
I don't know
I have
if
not
the third is
seen-
greenlit.
I haven't
We've
seen
heard that there was
anything.
rumors of a 3-parter even before this one came.
Part 1 and
out.
part 2 were shot together.
Correct.
So that was kind of like Netflix said, your story is good enough. We're going to go ahead
do
and pay
that.
for the
Right.
first 2.
Correct.
And, based off of audience reviews and ratings and all this other stuff, then we'll determine if we want to do like maybe part 3
All
and 4.
analytics
Or
and
if,
stats.
because
Yeah.
for as much as, this isn't marketed as a TV series.
Right.
If they had done like an 8-episode or
Yeah.
a 10-episode TV series with this, I feel like audience members would have been more engaged. They could have
Fleshed it out a little
fleshed it
more.
out a little bit more,
Okay.
given these little clips, these little
Yeah.
bites.
Yeah.
A little easier to digest this little nugget of information in a 1-hour block over 10 episodes.
Yeah.
And it I think would have performed better.
Yeah. That's a good
even
point.
even for me, I think it would have hit a little bit different.
And I feel like the way it did end, seeing as how the reviews aren't that good on this thing, and we didn't really talk about that. We just talked about viewership, the slide in viewership. But I think the general consensus on the internet is that this movie's not good. But like me and Button said, it's not the worst movie in the world, dude.
No.
It's just like, hey, sometimes the internet now, it's cool to pile on something and be like,
Oh,
"No,
yeah,
no, no,
didn't
no,
you
this is the
hate
worst
that?
ever." It's
Yeah,
like,
this was
I
terrible.
get it.
You're not wrong.
Yeah, it's not Star Wars. It's trying to be Star Wars. It was pitched as a Star Wars type film, and so this is what you get. You get Star Wars light. Like,
So do
you have to
you-
accept that it's Star Wars light.
Do you guys
It
feel
works
that
better as
this
show
would
to
be a
me.
better story
As
if
far as
it
what?
actually was Star Wars? Do you think you would have?
If Star Wars,
liked
it'd
it
be
more?
treated differently. If this was Star Wars, they would have gave him a $200 million budget. You would have had bigger
Okay.
actors. The visuals would have been crazier. It'd have been things that people that are fans of Star Wars would see and then be able to relate to. Because a lot of Star Wars is
If-
visual.
If you look
So-
at look at the Star Wars TV series that they've done recently,
Yeah.
Mandalorian, the
Ahsoka, Obi-Wan, Boba Fett.
Boba Fett. I personally don't. Now I haven't seen all of them. I've seen Mandalorian, all of Mandalorian, and I've seen the Boba Fett. But I have not seen Ahsoka yet, and I haven't seen the Obi-Wan series either, or even what was the other one, Andor.
Andor, yeah.
Yeah, so I haven't seen those ones. But me personally, if this had been a series, I feel like the quality of what Star Wars stories are, it would have fit in right in there. As far as the quality of acting, I don't think the actors were terrible. But I do think that because the story is so condensed to fit into a movie format as opposed to a TV series format, I feel like it hurt the story overall.
Yeah.
you know, when you, like what we've talked about before, when you take an 800-page book and you condense it down into a 2-hour movie, you're gonna leave a lot of stuff out.
Sure.
This, for all we know, was a fully fleshed out, well thought out story.
Right.
And Zack Snyder's coming in with, well, they're only greenlighting 2 2-hour movies. I've
And
got to
this
try
budget,
and.
this is what I got to work with.
Yeah, I got to try and make this as interesting as possible and stay as true to the story
Restricted.
as I can
Yep.
with having to cut way back on the content or way back on my visuals and what I'm able to do and is available to me to make the story
It'd be
work.
like giving J.J. Abrams a film that's similar to Star Trek, but he doesn't have all the Star Trek budget or Star Trek like he doesn't have the tools to actually make it on the same level of Star Trek. So like I said, when I say, you know, if this was something that was actually Star Wars, they would actually put more care into it.
Sure.
Interesting enough, like I said, it'd work better as a show. So as we know with shows, the numbers and how they make money off this stuff, I think is based off subscribership, right? And so you can't really tell what the show or this movie's gonna do because it's on a streaming platform. It's not a basic, you don't get a direct reflection of performance with this.
The
You
only-
can see
the
some
only
statistics,
thing-
but it's not
yeah.
like it made $200 million. And
Yeah,
so
it's
Star
like
Wars, for
how
the
many
most part,
people watched it.
Yep.
So, because like
Yep.
you were saying before with hours, they look and they say, okay, well, it's a 2-hour movie.
Yep.
And they say, okay, at some point, you know, somebody was streaming this. How long did they stream it for the full 2 hours?
Yep.
Or did they only stream it for 20 minutes and then
Yep.
they switch to something else?
Sure.
Because they're gonna be able to look at those statistics and factor that in. Oh, yeah, this one account streamed it for 8 hours. Well, hell, that means they watched it multiple times. They had to have.
and yep, and
there's-
then like you just said, then
Yeah.
you can break down how many people watched it based off
And-
the stream and
and
time.
then the only
so
other-
that gives you a gauge of how many
Okay.
people are actually watching it. Like,
Yeah,
can see
and-
that.
And then to the other aspect of it is because they don't have a lot of ways to review it, they got, I didn't like it, I liked it, and I loved it. Like, that's it. That's it. So, you know, some people, they never write a review. They watch the movie and they move on. Other people, they're like, nope, I went in there and I said I didn't like it. I thumbs down, right? And then another person might be like, yeah, I liked it, because then they use that in their algorithm to
Their
suggest other
analytics.
movies. Yeah, so they say, oh, yeah, you know, he obviously likes action movies because every time we put an action movie on here, he goes, I loved it. So we're gonna suggest more action movies.
Right.
We're gonna know that
Yeah.
my audience likes these action movies that I put out versus Six Underground, right? Like here, I'm gonna do a direct comparison of when we did Six Underground to Rebel Moon. You know, how many hours did they watch? How many people said they loved it versus how many people said they liked it versus how many people thumbs down, you know? And that's kind of how they.
the metrics.
Yeah, that's their metrics that they can put out to their shareholders and see, look, we paid $80 million for this movie, but look at how many views we got. Look at how many people said they liked it. And, you know, that if they said they liked it or loved it, they probably, you know, recommended it to a friend.
Exactly.
They probably went online and were talking about it on different forums or chat groups or whatever. When somebody brings out, you know, like us, we do reviews. So people
Yeah.
come on here and they say, oh yeah, I enjoyed that movie too. Or yeah, I agreed with you that movie was complete trash or whatever. Because that's kind of, they've got those people who are out there looking at that information.
Oh,
You
yeah,
know,
for sure.
IMBD, they got people who go on there and that's all they do all day long is they write reviews of movies and then they wait for the people to come in with their comments and say, oh yeah, and this, and did you forget about that? And oh yeah, I really like that scene. or-
Creates a dialogue within itself.
Exactly.
So, Buttons, since Kage is going to watch this, and I definitely probably going to touch on his take after the fact, after we watch both of these, because I want to see what he says about these. And the luxury he has is watching all these back to back. So you
Yeah.
can go in
True.
the first one and then go straight
Very
to the second
true.
one and be like, okay, this is what I think, as if it was one film, right?
Right.
So, do we agree that this would be better as a show?
Yes.
From what you guys are telling me, I feel like this would be way better.
Yep.
Way better as a show.
But does it hold up as far as compared to other movies that Netflix has done
Yeah,
as
I
far
think
as
it's
their
decent for a
originals?
Netflix movie.
Netflix, yeah. I mean, you watch, the quality is there. They didn't just phone it in. It's not a low budget.
Right.
We found this in the bargain basement bin of Walmart
Right,
and we paid, pennies on the dollar to throw it on our platform
Correct.
because it was cheap. They're like, no,
Yeah.
this was thought out. This was
Yep.
planned.
Well.
We got good director. We got
Decent
a decent
actors.
cast.
Okay.
We
Good
put
cast.
some money behind it.
People that you've seen before, right? And they got Zack Snyder shooting. So
Right, and
A
they-
name everybody knows pretty well at this point.
exactly. Whether you like him or not, he's shooting it. And so this isn't some guy that just popped out of nowhere.
Yeah,
right?
if
Sure.
you like Star Wars, it's not Star Wars,
Nope.
but it is.
But you can see the
You
resonances.
can, yeah,
Yep.
you can,
I got
you
you.
can see, if you like that genre, if you like the space epic, huge background and lore and things like that, the movie definitely has those elements. You could definitely go into long conversations about the lore of, ooh, do you think it's because of that? Or this guy, he has all this background information. And like I said, even with the original Star Wars movies, you're introduced to characters that you want to know more information about. This has that. You're introduced to characters, you're like, ooh, I want to know more about, where these people come from and what their story is. And I'd love to see maybe a movie that focused just on that one character. Because some of the characters are that interesting where you're like,
Okay.
tell me more,
All right.
But if this was in that Star Wars universe and they had picked it up, I feel like they would have had a lot more material to work with to bring in new characters and new, avenues to explore within that realm. Unfortunately, it wasn't picked up. Is Netflix gonna do that with this, where they create like a ton of spin-offs and like the way that Star Wars is able to? No, they're not going to. They're gonna tell this story. They're going to, for as much as what they can with what was pitched to them, I think they're gonna get their money's worth out of it, and then they're gonna move on. They're not
Okay.
gonna make it into this huge franchise. I feel like, if anything, with this series, they could get away with maybe 2 more movies. And just to give it a good wrap up, just to give it a full fleshed out
It's done
story.
here, yeah.
But
Okay.
and they could wrap it up in one. They could wrap it up in part 3.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Very easily. But I mean, if they wanted to push the envelope, I feel like they could have enough content to push it out to 4 parts.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good point.
Should they? I don't know. I'd have to watch part
We'll have to
3.
wait and see.
I'd have to watch part 3 and be like, no, they could have just wrapped that up. Like,
Right.
or no, I think there's more that they could keep going.
Based on what I've heard you guys say today, I think it's definitely worth a watch on my part.
Yeah,
Give
at
it a
least just
shot.
watch it,
and,
get an idea.
Yeah, let you
At least be
guys
able
know
to
my
see
thoughts
what
on
we're
it.
talking about, and so you could be like, okay, that makes sense. I see what they said there. Or
Okay.
that stands out.
And
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
if you absolutely hate part 1, don't watch part 2. But if you're sitting there at the end of part 1 going, oh man, I wish it had more action or a little bit more of,
Yeah, you'll get
that
there.
content, watch part 2.
Yeah.
It's
You'll
worth
That's
get
where
it.
it happens.
That's where.
That's very descriptive of what people said. Some people said of Dune Part 1. It's just a lot of talking. There's a build up. I'm invested. It's building up and
But where's
credits.
where's the-
And it's like no. Trust me. The first movie was just setting the stage, setting the tone, meat and potatoes, or like it was introducing the characters, the concept of why we're fighting. Okay, now that we've gotten that all out of the way, the second movie we're not explaining anything. We know what the stakes are. We know who the players are. We're gonna go, and it sounds to me this kind of touches on that some.
And that's why if it was a series, it would have been easier to be like, okay, here's your build. They could have rearranged some of the information as far as characters' backstories or even the main character's backstory in a way to where you still got a little bit of action with the introduction of characters.
Because when you
and
do
things
a
like that.
series, it affords you more time to jump
Exactly.
into what Buttons is talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And like we said, for 2 films, $166 million, they can make some money off this. This is not a
Okay.
Gray Man movie where it's $200 million and it's like Gray Man was what? Did no one talked about that movie? All they talked about the fact that it cost $200 million and it's on Netflix. Did they recoup? Probably not. And I watched Gray Man and it looked like a Netflix movie to me.
It
I
did.
wasn't like, oh, this looks like a big theatrical
If
release.
it-
Not
if
to
it
me,
had
it
been-
didn't.
if
$200
it-
million.
Yeah, if it
Six
that
Underground
movie-
looked more like a theatrical.
Yeah, it
to
did.
me, Six Underground looked like Michael Bay
Yeah.
type stuff, but with an action movie, no robots. Like it looked like we talked about Six Underground, and I don't think Michael Bay shot that. It might have been Michael Bay, honestly, but Six Underground, very reminiscent from a style aspect of like Michael Bay film, but take out the robots and stuff. It's just a pure action film, guns, cars, helicopters, stuff like that, luxury buildings, stuff like that, and that's on Netflix as well with Ryan Reynolds. So yeah, Six Underground. But
It was Michael Bay.
right, so
Wow.
it's Michael Bay, and that looked like a Michael Bay film. It didn't look like a Netflix film to me.
Were there a lot of
Gray Man looked like a
explosions?
Netflix
Yeah,
film.
there was a ton of
Yeah.
explosions.
Oh, definitely
Rebel,
Michael Bay.
Rebel Moon looks like
But-
a Netflix film, but
And
that
Michael
didn't.
Bay had done movies before
Correct.
he did Transformers. But,
Of course.
That's what
you
he's
know,
most known
he's,
for
he's
nowadays.
most known for, well,
Correct.
that and Teenage Mutant
Just
Ninja
so popular.
Turtles.
Yeah.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
All righty. So, Buttons,
Yeah.
you want to take us
Yeah,
out on this episode?
Yeah, so again, please, everybody, please like, subscribe, and let us know if you've seen the Rebel Moon movies, what you guys thought about it. Here we definitely will focus way more on information, but we want to hear your thoughts as well. And, I'm just going to go ahead and say that if you haven't seen the movies, be sure to give them a chance. If you've got Netflix, go out, watch them. I think the general consensus here is it's worth a watch. And with that, I'm Buttons, and I'm here with
Neff.
And Kage.
Be Safe, everybody.